Hi, folks. Welcome to week 9 of our supernatural folklore class, which is the week that we start talking about monsters. Um, the first article that we read for this week is Asama's article. I'm sorry, it's not an article. It's the introduction to the book Extraordinary Beings. And Asama spends a lot of time on the term monster and what that means. And monster, it turns out, means a lot of things. It can mean so many things, in fact, that Osama says on page 15 that it's probably fair to say, in reference to humans, that there is no longer any truly literal sense of the term. We've referred to many things as monsters. He points out that we have, number one, referred to creatures as monsters. Osama makes the point that there are certain creatures that we fear as being monstrous: snakes, spiders, sea creatures. There was a 3-ton sunfish that was discovered in the ocean a few weeks ago. And the idea of a fish that weighs 3 tons seems a bit monstrous, right? We've seen gigantic catfish that are larger than human beings. And so those creatures are often thought of as being monstrous. Our fear of these creatures does not really seem to correlate with the actual danger of the creature. A 3-ton sunfish may crush us, but it's probably not going to eat us. Um, he points out that some theorists believe that our brains might be hardwired to be afraid of some things that could cause us danger. So, in other words, this might be an evolutionary leftover to be afraid of things that might have caused serious danger in the past, even though they may not be as dangerous now. He also thinks that this hardwiring of our brain might be a reason that some phobias are resistant to treatment. There are lots of phobias out there, and some of them are more resistant to treatment than others. Number two, he points out that human beings have a difficult time looking away from deformity or other sights that are considered monstrous. Um, at one time, people who were born with deformities were considered monsters, although we've largely stopped using that kind of language and having that attitude toward people. Um, he says that we apply that to inhuman creatures, even if those creatures are people. So, for example, if you look at something like the Elephant Man or some other people that were born with various deformities, we used to put those folks in freak shows and exhibit them to make money as monsters. Um, he says that we experience both an attraction to and revulsion with the face of a monster. It's like there's almost this sense of you look at it because you're trying to figure out exactly what it is or what is wrong, or how it exists in that form, which explains the attraction to, but there's also a sense of revulsion there. Number three, he points out that it is a choice to become a monster. Um, One has to give up one's humanity in order to become one. He uses the example in the reading of Pol Pot, who was a dictator in Cambodia that murdered millions of people in various extremely terrible ways. Um, Also, we could look at Hitler as another form of monster, or any of our modern day serial killers are often referred to as monsters because their deeds are monstrous. He says that something becomes monstrous when we can no longer understand why it does what it does. If we're looking at the example of dictators or criminals. And he uses the example of his brother to point out when we know someone and they become familiar, they can't really be monsters to us anymore. We experience a kind of empathy for them. Um, he also says that monsters are unmanageable. That's point number 4. Monsters can't be controlled. They are beyond our strength to contain. So, for example, if you look at something like Godzilla or King Kong, both of which were monsters that were just too large and were animals that we could not control. There throughout the 50s and 60s, there were a large number of these kinds of monsters in media, um, giant wasps, Mothra. Um, the idea that these creatures that had been survivals of an earlier time, or creatures that were created by science and technology, sort of reveals this kind of common fear in society about technology and where it was going and what science was capable of. Um, Point number 5 he makes is that monsters are omens. Monsters prepare us in for the metaphoric way that things decline. He feels that monsters are metaphorical archetypes. And he looks at how our description of a monster defines the ways we see it in our culture, because metaphors tend to shape our thinking. It's often easier for us to conceptualize ideas when we can find some sort of analogy to them. And so when we think about the ways in which our culture is declining, it may be easier to look at that in the context of some type of monster. Um, so his point here is that um, monster number one monster the term monster is a flexible and multi-use concept. There is a moral as well as a biological and theological aspect to the term monster. We apply it to humans who have abdicated their humanity. That something is monstrous when we can no longer understand it. It can't be processed by our rationality. Um, monst- Monsters are something unmanageable. A monster cannot, because of its failings, do what it was created to do without causing chaos. It's dangerous without intentionally being so, or sometimes intentionally so. I think a good example of this is the Frankenstein monster. If you're familiar with Frankenstein, the monster was created by Dr. Frankenstein um, because he wanted to basically play God and give life to this creature. But and the monster did damage, right? Um, but it didn't intentionally do damage. It wasn't. It just wasn't. It wasn't. It didn't have a consciousness of what it was doing, and so a monster can be very dangerous, even though it doesn't intend to be dangerous. He also says that monsters are culturally based. They reveal what a culture values and believes. Um, and one kind of monster that is still pretty popular, at least in media storytelling, is vampires. So we looked at in week 8 what Barber and Tucker had to say about vampires. So the first article for us to talk about is Barber's introduction from Vampires, Burial, and Death. Folklore and reality. So, Barber here is discussing the relationship between vampire legends and what he calls the unschooled observations of individuals looking on at the dissection of exhumed bodies. And this is um, very early research um, looking at what happens to bodies as they decompose. I'm not going to try to tell you this discussion is appetizing, so I hope you haven't had lunch yet or you're not watching this during lunch. So before we get to some of the issues with the reading, um, his thesis and his observations from the evidence that he presents. His thesis is that the belief in vampirism, at least in its earliest forms, not maybe what we have now, resulted from a misunderstanding of the scientific process of bodies as they decay. Now, to prove this thesis, he examines the recorded accounts of exhumations of people who were believed to be vampires, and he breaks those down into the salient points that are common among them. And so the common features he lists are, number 1, the suspected vampire either died an unexpected, possibly violent death, and or was a person who had been querulous during their lifetime. In other words, it was a grumpy old something. right? It was a person that other people didn't get along with. Something happened to them. Either they had a tragic accident, they died unexpectedly, they were killed. And that seemed to be one of the common features of folks that were eventually considered to be vampires. Upon exhumation of the body, the skin was found to be ruddy or reddish, and there was evidence of new growth of the skin, the hair, and the fingernails. And the body has also not decayed to the expected point when it is exhumed. There may be evidence of fresh blood and blood in the body that appears not to be coagulated. The body is not stiff, and there may not be a smell of putrescence, although some bodies do indeed smell. He says that this is a common feature among bodies that were exhumed because the person was suspected of being a vampire. Vampirism, he also says, number 3, that vampirism is considered to be epidemic. This person died, and then they are held responsible for the subsequent deaths of community members. 4, he says that vampires create all sorts of mischief, not just the sucking of blood or the suffocation of victims, but they would be blamed for things like the death of livestock, or milk going bad, or unsuccessful harvest, or any number of goings on would often be attributed to these individuals who are vampires. And he says number 5, staking, stabbing, burning, and dismemberment all seem to be acceptable ways of disposing of a vampire. And many times these methods might be combined until the vampire was considered vanquished by the community. So in some cases, you might see that this body would be dug up, it would be staked, it would be reburied. Some sort of incident would occur that would be attributed to the vampire. It may be dug back up and dismembered at that point. And then if anything else happened, they might dig it up and burn it. So these methods might be combined until the community was absolutely certain that the vampire had been vanquished. Barber talks about the evidence presented in a case of Arnold Paole to give us some additional information. The blood of the vampire may sometimes be considered to be an antidote to vampirism, although this does not work in the case of Mr. Paole, according to Barber. The victims of vampires become vampires, as well as folks who eat the flesh of animals who have been the victim of vampires. So if the vampire was feeding on livestock, that livestock was then eaten. The person who ate the livestock could also become a vampire. He also says that the observer of the exhumed body contrasts the condition of the bodies buried near the vampire with the state of the vampire, and he finds that those that are buried around the vampire that are not thought to be vampires themselves are considered normal, while the vampire's body is not normal. All right. And he points out some ways that the Brachylochus was a different case. The Brachylochus, which is often considered to be similar to vampires in some ways, but those are reanimated by the devil, and they smell. So incense is burned to cover the smell of decomposition. And the examiner writing the account about the Brachylochus did not believe that the deceased was a vampire. So it was a different type of. So basically, you could say that the observer here could be biased or not in the case of looking at these. If this particular examiner in this particular case did not believe that the deceased person was a vampire. So we can see how some of these post-mortem observations might lead a person who had limited knowledge of pathology to believe that there was something amiss with those bodies, and that they could be vampires. All right. Particularly the appearance that the body is not decomposed sufficiently and the appearance of fresh blood in the mouth. I mean, those are both fairly common features of vampire lore. And so, someone observing that who didn't know much about decomposition might take that as evidence of a person being a vampire. Barber points out that these incidents are actually not uncommon among dead bodies, but they just weren't often observed in the 1700s to early 1900s. Just our pathology had not advanced that quickly. He points out something rather interesting in the first case study, that of Peter Plagowitz, in that in some vampires there's evidence of an erection when the body is exhumed. And he says Barber says this kind of gives rise to the idea that we've discussed, or that's sometimes discussed in connection with vampires. Vampires are viewed as these sort of sensual creatures with sexual appetites. And often, if you look at media around vampires, and in literary canon, if even something like Nosferatu, if you have ever watched Nosferatu, um, Nosferatu is hideous looking, right? But there is still this sense that he has this sort of sexual magnetism over women. Same with Count Dracula. This occurs quite frequently in literature about vampires, that they have this sort of sexual component that is mesmerizing to their victims, and thus their victims kind of fall prey to them, kind of based on this sexual attraction. So, this little tidbit about the evidence of an erection when a body is exhumed does seem to have found its way into kind of our popular conception of vampires. And overall, when we read Barber's observations about European vampires, they do kind of make sense to us, right? We are somewhat more enlightened about the processes of decomposition, and we understand things like rigor mortis sets in after someone dies, but then it eventually goes away. Things like hair and skin and fingernails continue to grow after the death of a person, because those are dead cells anyway. And so we do seem to know a little bit more about decomposition than certainly the the individual accounts that Barber is observing here. Um, so we can kind of make a connection why folks believed that maybe these people in their community had become vampires. But I do have some problems with Barber's article, all right, and I want to discuss those, mostly because I want you to be able to critique your own work if you're exhibiting some of these same attitudes. First of all, I don't like the way that he uses folklore here. He uses folklore in the sense of stuff that's not true or not realistic, and that's a really limited way that isn't really reflective of what folklorists actually do. All right. I talked about this a little when I was looking at discussion boards this week. Do mind I'm doing this lecture late because my camera wasn't working. So someone gave the example when we were talking about monsters of we were talking about digital folklore, and they said the dark web, right? There's a lot of folklore about the dark web and what one can find there. All right. But the dark web exists, right? It's an actual thing that's out there, right? Is as intangible and nebulous as the internet is, there is such a place as the dark web. All right. But there is a ton of folklore about the dark web. It's not that that folklore is not true. It's not that those things do not happen. It's just that the stories often outpace the actual event. All right. We know that there have been cases of landlords, um, um, placing cameras in apartments or homes or rental properties and watching tenants without their knowledge, right? But the number of stories that are told about that, and the ways that we are warned about that, and the chain letters that we receive about looking for that far outpaces the number of actual incidents that happen, right? So it's not that folklore is not true, all right? It's the way that we share those stories. And Barber here in this article is really looking at folklore as something that is not true, does not happen, old wives' tales, stories that are told that are untrue. That is not actually a reflection of what folklorists do. And I also don't like Barber's attitude that the belief in the supernatural being of a vampire is based solely on the ignorance of processes of decomposition. And it completely disregards anybody who might be more educated about decomposition but still believes in vampires. He does not make any effort to understand that any of these beliefs beyond, oh, people just didn't know any better, right? And we talked about that when we read Goldstein, the idea that there is a perception, and in some cases it's true, that supernatural things were attributed out of ignorance or out of a primitive kind of belief, right? But supernatural belief does not decline as people become more educated. We also pointed that out, right? Those ideas can coexist comfortably and do for many people. So I really don't like the way he's like, oh well, they just didn't know any better, and that's why they believe in vampires. And I'm not real crazy about the distinction that he makes between literary and legendary vampires. I get it, right? It is necessary to explain some of the origins of the cultural conceptions that we have about vampires. But it doesn't make our stories about vampires less authentic if they include literary elements. These lines between popular culture, formal culture, and folk culture are really fluid, okay? We have pieces of literature, Dracula, for instance, that are written that contain elements of vampire legend. Those elements are widely read by a large number of people. They share that between themselves in stories. They attribute it to legend. It gets incorporated into the stories that they tell. All right. And then those stories in turn inspire another vampire story, like Anne Rice's Interview with a Vampire, or God help us, Twilight, right? So there's this kind of fluid thing where, folklore is not owned by anyone. It's anonymous, right? It's the stories that people tell each other. It's not attributed to any one person. But this folklore stuff is often co-opted by popular culture because it sparks somebody's imagination, and then they write a book or they make a movie or they do something like that with this kind of folk culture, all right? And then once it's in popular culture, people watch it, see it, read it, and then it goes back into folk culture again. So these lines between things are kind of nebulous, and ideas move in and out. So he really tries to differentiate between literary monsters, literary vampires, and then folk vampires, but the line isn't quite as clear as he seems to want to make it. And I don't know Mr. Barber personally, but he could benefit from changing his tone somewhat. He's kind of condescending in his writing, and it's not attractive. He's really not going to persuade anybody that doesn't already agree with him. And that's not the goal in academic writing. Please don't be like Mr. Barber in your own writing. All right. So the last article that I want to talk about this week is Tucker's article about the Great New England Vampire Panic. Now, this article is a popular source. It's from the Smithsonian Magazine. And so not scholarly, but it is well researched, and certainly a good article for us to look at. A lot of us are familiar with the ways that one becomes a vampire. You are either bitten by a vampire or you consume the blood of a vampire. And everybody knows that while vampires can consume animal blood, I believe Stephenie Meyer termed those vampires vegetarians. They prefer to drink human blood. Generally, vampires are thought to be very sexually attractive. They are thought to be significantly wealthy. They are thought to be extremely intelligent. This is often owing to their very long lives. They are often depicted as being allergic or prone to damage from the sun, from religious iconography. Whip out your cross. Garlic, the strong smell of garlic. Another common factor among almost all variations of vampire is that they prey on the living by drinking blood. This often causes their victims to appear to waste away over time. If you will remember from reading Dracula in high school, when Lucy becomes the victim of Count Dracula, she doesn't die immediately. She sort of declines over a period of time, becoming increasingly weak, increasingly pale, and also usually increasingly um, sexually uninhibited. So the death from a vampire often didn't occur immediately. There was often this appearance of sort of wasting away. So if you look at this particular case in New England in the late 1800s and early 1900s, um, this victims wasting away was kind of the central point of this. Now, the New England vampire panic is a phenomenon which has been extensively studied by a folklorist named Michael Bell. And the story is that townsfolk in rural areas of New England would disinter and dismember their fellow citizens upon their death on the suspicion that they were vampires who were returning from the grave to prey on their neighbors. Now, these stories are not. These stories occur in various places throughout the United States, this kind of image of vampirism. But New Englanders are particularly circumspect, or often have the reputation of being particularly circumspect and not given to hysteria because of those puritanical roots. I'm not exactly sure why that is, because the Puritans were kind of disposed to hysteria sometimes. You'll also find a lot of vampire legends in and around New Orleans. I think if you look at any city that has had a significant um, plague history, in New Orleans, it was yellow fever in particular that plagued that area, where you had a lot of people dying in this sort of wasting way. A lot of times, that sort of dying is attributed to vampirism. But this happened in New England again. So Tucker, our author here, poses that almost all of the exhumations and dismemberments came at the same time as TB outbreaks in the community. Um, Basically, TB is a disease in which victims waste away due to the lack of functionality in their lungs. They appear pale, weak, short of breath, have rapid weight loss, have an incessant cough that often produces blood from the mouth. Sounds like vampires, right? But in this particular case, Tucker is focusing on the case of Lena Brown, who was a young woman in Rhode Island, and she was exhumed and dismembered. I actually think that this story is told in the Amazon Prime series Lore. I think they depict this story. So Lena's mother first kind of exhibited the symptoms of TB, and then her sister started having symptoms, and both of them died, and then they were buried. But then Lena and her brother Edwin also started exhibiting symptoms of tuberculosis. And tuberculosis is actually highly contagious. We don't have a lot of it in the United States at this point. Most of the time when we see TB in the United States, you see that on Native American reservations, or you see that among the homeless population, or you see that among people who have traveled to areas like Haiti or parts of Africa, um, places that are less developed. In many ways, you don't see a lot of TB cases in the United States much anymore. But at this time, there was a lot of TB. There weren't good treatments for it. It wasn't well understood. We had entire hospitals that were devoted to it, like Waverly Hills in Louisville, or, so Lena started to exhibit symptoms. Her brother started to exhibit symptoms, and she died. And that, when she died, the townspeople sort of approached her father and said, "This sounds like vampirism." And so they wanted to disinter his body, disinter the family bodies in order to kind of save Edwin from also dying, because it was thought that, they didn't save Lena. She had been preyed upon by a vampire until she died, but maybe they could save Edwin if they could dig up the family and they could stop the vampire in its tracks. When the mother and sister were disinterred, they were skeletal remains, so there was no reason to think they were vampires. Lena's body appeared to have much less deep composition and thus was suspected of being the vampire. So her heart and liver were cut out. They were burned, and the ashes of those were fed to Edwin. Now, remember when we said that the vampire's blood might be an antidote to vampirism? It seems this might be a variation on that. And Edwin died anyway. But Lena's exhumation was big news. All right. There were sensational accounts in the newspapers. The word spread pretty far that New Englanders were dealing with vampires in their community. And this particular story predates Bram Stoker, his Dracula novel, by several months. He had likely already written Dracula when this started being reported. But there definitely seems to be some similarities in the description of the death of Lucy and the reporting of the death and dismemberment of Lena. And it's possible, but it's not particularly likely, that the two accounts could be related. I have you read this article for a couple of reasons. One is that we think of vampire lore outside of what we see in film as literature is something that's being really old, right? And that this was something that people believed in the Dark Ages. And I want you to realize that these stories had an effect on people and on their actions much more recently than many of us really kind of think it occurred. The second reason that I have you to read this is because I really like some of the comments that Michael Bell makes here. In this article when he's interviewed by Tucker. He makes this really interesting observation that I want you to keep in mind. When you're looking at, we're looking at beliefs, and it's not necessary for you to believe these things. It's not necessary for me to believe these things. But what I do want you to keep in mind is that we should be looking for the logic. Why would somebody do this? Once you label something just a superstition, you really lock off all of the inquiry into something that could have been reasonable. And Bell says here, reasonable is not always rational. All right. So one of the ideas that I want you to think about is that there are cases in life when you're out of options. All right. Whether that is an illness, a disease, that there are just no other good treatments for, whether that is a condition or situation in life that you feel trapped in and you really just can't see another way out of. When those kinds of things happen and you really sort of lose hope, people will do things that may not seem rational, but certainly seem reasonable. All right. For example, someone who's facing a terminal cancer diagnosis may very well turn to prayer, the laying on of hands by church members. They may turn to herbalism. They may turn to granny magic or hoodoo or some other type of magical practice to be healed of that. All right. And it's not rational, but it is reasonable, right? There's no They seem to be out of options from traditional medicine. And so at that point, they may turn to non traditional places. Um, the same the same thing may occur if someone the same thing occurs with love spells, right? If you are desperately in love with someone and they are just not into you and you want to change their mind and there's no other way to do it, then it's not rational by any means, but it does become reasonable for some folks to want to intervene in something like that with some sort of magical option. So, yeah, you can look at this and say, oh, well, that's just superstition. That stuff's not going to work, right? But you really lock yourself off from delving in further to really understand a situation when you write those sorts of things off as being irrational and unreasonable. All right. So what I want you to understand is that what is reasonable may not always be rational, particularly when you're in the thick of it. Um, in our everyday lives, we place a lot of emphasis on whether or not legends are true. And there is, I can't say that enough, there is a reason and a need to differentiate misinformation from evidence. All right. Um, but reasonable is not always rational. Sometimes people have reasons to want to believe, and understanding those reasons can give us a lot of information to help us make sense of things. Um, so, Bell goes on in this article to say something else that I think is pretty important for you to think about. People find themselves in dire situations, and when they do, when there's no recourse through regular channels, the folk system offers an alternative or a choice. And sometimes superstitions represent the only hope. All right. Again, if you're talking to somebody who's been diagnosed with a terminal disease and they've exhausted all the other possibilities that medical science can offer them, they want to hope in something. They will turn that hope to somewhere else. And it may be religious belief, which is also supernatural belief, or it may be something like traditional, folk medicine. But sometimes when that's all that's left, that's what people will go to. And understanding that, I think, is very important. And it keeps us from writing off things um, just because we feel like they're silly or untrue or irrational or there's no evidence for that, right? There's still something to learn there. Um, so as we ask ourselves why someone would believe their neighbor had turned into a vampire and want to dig up their body and cut them into pieces and burn them, um, reasonable is not always rational, right? TB is a disease that mimics a lot of the symptoms of vampire predation. We talked, excuse me, we talked about that, right? Um, in New Orleans, again, there were several stories of individuals with yellow fever who appeared to have died and were interred. And then you find out that they weren't dead and they rose from their graves and they looked terrible. A, because they've been buried for a few days, and B, they were sick, right? But they were the undead walking around. Bell thinks it's likely that vampire legends reached New England through Slavic and German influences in immigration and in military service. But some scholars believe that vampire superstitions persisted because they made practical sense. All right. People observing exhumed bodies made observations of what they learned. And some of those observations backed up what they thought about vampires. So another folklorist, Paul Barber, says, the beliefs about vampires get to the heart of contagion. Illness begets illness, death, death. Okay? If you think about this, if burning a body kept germs from spreading. But that's not what people understood. They just knew that burning a body made whatever stop happening. Then, you know, they're still fighting a contagion. And I think our CDC has finally recognized this in the last, I don't know, 10 years or so. With the increase in popularity of zombies in our popular culture, the CDC released a guide about what to do in the event of a zombie apocalypse. Now, some people say that's because the government is engineering zombies. I don't exactly think that's true. I think that if you look at the guidelines for what to do in a zombie apocalypse, you're pretty well prepared for any emergency event that comes along, whether it's a hurricane, whether it's a tornado, whether it's a wildfire. All right. And the evidence, and you know, the information that they give is the same, right? It's all a disaster. So if you think about these things, right, it comes to make more sense than maybe it does on its face. If you don't have the scientific advancements to understand exactly what illness is, what causes it, how it spreads, how people get it, right, then it's reasonable, even if it's not rational, that you might do some of these things. And so that's the big lesson that I want you to take away from this one, right? You know, what is reasonable is not always rational. And sometimes those superstitions, those folk remedies, that folklore really kind of represents the best hope that people have. All right, so that is it for week 9, our first week of monsters. I'm going to go ahead and record my lecture on week 10, and then I'll record my lecture on week 11. So you're going to see me in the same shirt 3 weeks in a row, but that's okay. So talk to you more soon. Have a great night.